We have now reached the end of our course. In this last video, I would like to revisit some of the slides that we saw at the beginning, all the way recapitulating on some key ideas and hopefully gaining a deeper understanding of what I meant with them. I would also like to recapture the fascinating questions about language that we formulated at the beginning and give you an idea of the large spectrum of disciplines that address them, all of them grouped under the broad umbrella of linguistics. Remember that we define linguistics as the scientific study of language, and we paid some attention to the two important elements in this definition. Linguistics is scientific because it is based on empirical data, and it uses the inductive method to construct a theoretical framework by proposing and testing hypotheses, all the way maintaining the coherence between these components. And as for the object of our study, we determined that it is more complex than we might have imagined, and we now know that it can keep us busy for a long and entertaining time. There is one idea that I would like to insist on. Language is so complex, and it is such an omnipresent reality in our human lives that we cannot study it as a whole. We really need to consider its different components separately. The basic components of language are sounds, or gestures, remember, which depend on our articulatory and perceptive systems, and meaning, a product of our mind being able to form concepts and intentions. And while the association of a particular sound with a particular meaning is arbitrary, there is a whole deal of systematic relations that hint to language having a highly sophisticated structure. Only by examining in detail each one of its components and the relationship between them can we start to have a clearer image of the phenomenon of human language. Obviously, there's still some more or less fine-tuning to do, but linguistics as a discipline is off to a good start. When we take the different structural components of language separately, we can at least formulate some of the things that we know when we know a language. Each speaker of a language has knowledge about what combinations of sounds occur in this language, its sound inventory or phonetic inventory and its phonological rules, how to combine sounds to form words and sentences, this language's morphology and syntax, and how to relate sounds with meaning, its semantics and pragmatics, including its manipulations. In sum, linguistics concerns itself with the fundamental questions of what language is and how it is related to other human faculties. In addition to examining the anatomy of this fascinating human ability, linguists also study language as a cultural, social, and psychological phenomenon, and seek to determine, for example, what is unique in languages, what is universal, how language is acquired and used, and how it changes. Linguistics is, therefore, one of the cognitive sciences. It provides a link between the humanities and the social sciences, as well as education and hearing and speech sciences. The many perspectives one can take in studying language have given rise to a group of disciplines that differ among themselves in their focus and methodologies, but that can be all included within linguistics, because they all try to answer fundamental questions about language. In the following slides, I will present some of these different fields and give you a general idea of the kind of inquiry they address. This way, you can decide what to explore next. Linguistic typology compares grammars of different languages, and it reveals systematic patterns of variation. For example, it might examine the subject-verb-object ordering in the languages of the world and propose a classification according to this parameter, and then explain why one pattern is more common than the other and the consequences that derive from that in the structural and functional properties of the languages. Or, for example, it can compare the grammatical systems and lexicons of different languages and compute how close a group of languages are, which might be the basis for studies on mutual intelligibility, genetic relatedness, and so forth. Look at the diagram on lexical distances from the Romance family in the slide. This is a genetic family, but typology is also interested in the comparison between non-related languages that might have influenced each other due to being in contact, that is, in situations of bilingualism. Typologists can dedicate their efforts to make qualitative observations about a single language or group of languages in order to advance in the description and explanation of their grammars, oftentimes collecting fascinating data that reveals a new twist on the complexity of the human linguistic systems that had not been detected before. Or they can engage on quantitative analysis of the variation patterns that we already know, in order to map their distribution geographically, as in the map you have in the slide about verb-object or object-verb languages, or to uncover correlations between a given grammatical or functional feature and another with the help of computational aids. Historical linguistics is also called diachronic linguistics, and it is the study of language change through time. It describes and reconstructs the history of languages, and it also aims to determine their relatedness by grouping them in historical language families. The study of the historical development of individual words is etymology. Historical linguistics also develops general theories about how and why language changes, and for this it draws data from many approaches and methodologies, including typology, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, grammatical studies, the study of writing systems, and so on. Sociolinguistics is the study of language in relation to society. It studies how language varies between groups or communities, defined on the basis of non-linguistic terms, such as what socioeconomical class they belong to, what ethnicity or gender identity they claim, or where they are from. It can examine, for example, whether a certain syntactic feature occurs more often in the speech of people belonging to a certain social or ethnic group, or geographical dialect, or, like in the graph on the side, the distribution of swearing on Twitter during the different times in the day. You can also make a sociolinguistic analysis of the relationships between different languages within and across communities, and how people feel about language and language diversity, that is, their linguistic attitudes. Sociolinguistic studies are almost exclusively quantitative. Sociolinguists aim to discover generalizations about the speech of the groups they are studying through statistical analysis of the recorded data. Discourse analysis is perhaps more a methodology than a discipline, but in any case, it aims to reveal socio-psychological characteristics of a speaker or a community of speakers through analyzing their choice of words and conversational strategies, such as turn-taking, intonation, gestures, syntax, etc., in producing a text or a conversation. It is related to the more traditional rhetoric, which is the art of structuring your speech in order to persuade or motivate your audience in specific situations, such as at the doctor's office, a date, or a political speech. Anthropological linguistics is also very related to sociolinguistics and sociology of language, in the sense that it studies the role of language in culture and society, and the way different communities see the world. Unlike sociolinguistics, it is usually based on qualitative methods of inquiry, especially in ethnography, as opposed to quantitative ones. Examples of anthropological linguistic studies are the language ideologies that promote the hegemony of English in the US school system, or the role that language plays in the construction of national identities. Psycholinguistics is the study of the psychological factors that enable humans to acquire, use, comprehend, and produce language. One large line of research in psycholinguistics is adult language processing. It studies how people understand sentences in real time, by presenting the person with a sentence and measuring how much time they stare at a particular word, or how long it takes them to be aware of an ambiguity, for example. The other line of research is language acquisition, which studies the way babies learn to speak their language or languages. A growing relative recent interest in psycholinguistics refers to multilingual people, by addressing questions regarding how bilinguals acquire and represent their languages in their minds, and comparing it to supposedly monolingual speakers, in order to find out whether the amount of languages one learns and uses has an effect in cognition or psychological and social developments and behavior, for example. Another example is studying how bilinguals make use of their language resources to express themselves and effectively adapt to their interlocutors. Psycholinguistics almost always employs experimental methods, and its research is carried out in laboratories under highly controlled circumstances. The results are computed statistically, and generalizations are made based on as large a database as possible. Neurolinguistics studies a lot of the same issues as psycholinguistics, but it goes a step further by studying the neural mechanisms and the regions in the human brain that control the comprehension, production, and acquisition of language. It is a relatively new field, because only recently we have the brain imaging techniques that allow us to see and measure the functioning of the brain as it is being stimulated by linguistic material. Many times, neurolinguistics studies pathologies in the brain that have an effect on the language of the unfortunate person who suffers them, including cases of strokes, brain tumors, and certain genetic abnormalities that cause aphasias, dyslexias, or the development of unusual linguistic behaviors. Cognitive science is an umbrella field that studies human and non-human intelligence. Since language is so central to intelligence, it is just natural that linguistics occupies a central place in the study of our cognition. So linguistics is one of the cognitive sciences. In fact, cognitive science is in essence interdisciplinary, including studies that go beyond traditional disciplinary boundaries and try to relate insights that are originally produced by research within psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, philosophy, artificial intelligence and computer science, mathematics, and of course, linguistics. The philosophical study of language, while in principle is any general reflection on the phenomenon of language as a whole, is more often understood as the analytical inquiry on the notion of meaning and the relationship between language and reality. Philosophers of language aim to explain what it means to mean something, and how can meaning ever be communicated. A very prevalent field within the philosophical side of linguistics is the systematic and even mathematically rigorous account of language, especially within semantics. Applied linguistics is another interdisciplinary field of linguistics that investigates and offers solutions to real-life problems regarding language. Some topics within applied linguistics are language policies in education, new language learning, many times called second language learning or L2 learning, speech pathologies and their therapies, translation and interpreting studies, language planning, including managing language diversity in a community, but also standardization and development of writing systems for undocumented languages, and finally, the linguistic analysis of creative literature. Any research that takes advantage of the use of computers to either model or analyze language falls under the umbrella of computational linguistics, which is a field closely in contact with artificial intelligence and more generally cognitive science. For example, machine translation, speech recognition by machines, or robots modeling human behavior, and the construction of statistical grammar, or computing of frequencies of lexical items or syntactic constructions within large databases so that we can analyze different dialects or tendencies of linguistic change within a group. Translation studies include the systematic study of the theory, description, and application of translation and interpreting. Questions such as whether it is possible to translate concepts deeply rooted in one culture to another, or what the best way to translate humor or politeness is, or whether a translation is a separate piece of work from its original, are all central in translation studies, as are the techniques of simultaneous interpreting in the different settings it is required in the modern world. Lexicography is the science of dictionary writing. This seems simple, but the confection of a dictionary is not a trivial task. We need to decide what words to include and which words are not alive in the language anymore. And we need to compile the many contexts in which new words appear or the new contexts in which old words might be used in order to give an accurate description of their meaning and their use. And since dictionaries are oftentimes used in a prescriptive manner, we need to do all this responsibly, so that no group within the community is given the power to impose their way of speaking onto others. Notice that lexicography can be understood as a subfield of applied linguistics. Another branch of applied linguistics is forensic linguistics. It is the application of linguistic knowledge, methods, and insights to the forensic context of law, crime investigation, trial, and judicial procedure. Forensic linguists are called to court, or should be called, as experts in determining, for example, the plausibility of a person declaring to be from a country or community for immigration purposes, or to ensure that the communication between plaintiffs and juries or judges is not impeded by them coming from different speech communities. They are also instrumental in formulating and interpreting the language of the written law and in understanding language use in forensic and judicial procedures. Biolinguistics is the study of the biological foundations of language, including its evolution. This is perhaps the youngest of the disciplines we are discussing here, and arguably it falls under the umbrella of the cognitive sciences. Lately, researchers have been exploring the possibility that in humans, a particular gene, called FOXP2, is responsible for language, although the evidence is controversial. Biolinguists ask questions such as, what are the evolutionary pressures that resulted in the selection of language over other possible alternatives for communication and cognitive organization? Or are the cognitive processes responsible for language specialized for this cognitive capacity or shared with other mental abilities? And of course, questions regarding language acquisition by babies and non-human language skills, especially as they reveal the genetic or functional history of our own species. Ecolinguistics emerged in the 1990s as a new paradigm of linguistics research which took into account not only the social context in which a language is embedded, but also the ecological context in which societies are embedded. And this is meant quite literally, as for example, examining the consequences of the discourses about economic relationships, consumerism, gender, agriculture, nature, and so on the environment. But ecolinguistics is also concerned in a more metaphorical sense with linguistic ecosystems in the sense of examining how languages interact with each other and the places they are spoken in, and frequently argues, for example, for the preservation of endangered languages as an analogy for the preservation of biological species. In any case, it is a new discipline that is very close to others like sociolinguistics, discourse analysis, and typology, but with a new twist that wants to make linguistics relevant for the way we are thinking about the problems of the world in the 21st century. And this is the end of the course. I hope it poked your interest on the study of language and that together with the online exercises, it gave you an idea of how we can start to examine this fascinating phenomenon of the human mind. Obviously, most of the interesting questions about language that we formulated at the beginning, we haven't even started to answer. But having more questions than answers is not a bad place to be. And now, I would like to acknowledge everybody who've made this course possible. To you, thank you, and good luck.